of the time. And as Elizabeth Parcher said in her biography of Woody Guthrie, it was clear Dylan had grabbed the scepter that Woody had held defiantly overhead for so long, the ability to write and sing new folk songs honed by the political turmoil and oppression of the times. But I feel as though since Dylan, we haven't really had anyone to take that scepter in the same manner. And today we find ourselves in what they call the Great Recession. And in reality, all depressions are recessions and vice versa. And the Great Recession echoes many of the same problems that plagued my grandparents' generation, but it also differs quite extensively. But both did start because of bad investments. However, the Great Recession hasn't hit people the same way as the Great Depression has. The Great Recession technically started in 2007, and it supposedly ended 18 months after that in 2009, but as far as I am concerned, we're definitely still feeling the effects. The unemployment rate currently sits at 8.1%, and that is drastically lower than the 25% that hit the Great Depression. But if you look at the numbers, both sit around 12 million people without work. And although this is down from last year, before the crash in December 2007, the unemployment rate was 5%, and then it peaked in October 2009 when it hit 10%, which is the highest it's been since the Great Depression. And from what I understand, we essentially have the housing market to blame for all of our troubles. At the beginning of this century, the housing market was really hopping. And between 1997 and 2006, record numbers of people were buying homes because mortgage interest rates were really, really low, which meant many more people could afford them. The problem was, people who were receiving mortgages didn't always have a good credit history. Mortgages were sold to people whose credit history was rather low, proving that they wouldn't actually be paying back their mortgages. There was also this idea that people would buy a house really cheap, and then in a few years they would sell it again, and they would get really rich. So, this is sort of along the ideas of what happened in the Great Depression. People were buying their shares really cheaply and then quickly selling them to make more money. So eventually what happened was that people with bad credit history started defaulting on their mortgage payments. So when you default on your mortgage payment, this essentially means that the bank who owns your mortgage owns your home. And so all of a sudden the banks owned a bunch of homes they didn't want. So they started selling them really cheaply, which caused the housing market to plummet. Again, like the stock market did in the late 1920s. But an opposite problem has occurred in this past decade than happened during the Great Depression. In the early 2000s, people were saving more money than they were spending, and by 2006, there was $70 trillion in savings, and it needed to be invested. So, someone came up with this brilliant idea that they were going to bundle mortgages together and sell them as investments. So when people paid their mortgages, then your investment would go up. Now maybe this is just me and my total naivety when it comes to investing, but this sounds like an awful idea. Why would you invest your hard-earned money in other people's debt? Like, that's awful. But the system was working in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s because people could make their mortgage payments. But then the people with the bad credit history started defaulting, and things went downhill fast. So in early 2007, a record number of people were defaulting on their mortgage payments, meaning the people who had invested in the mortgages were thus losing their investments, and the housing prices plunged. Lending companies closed down, investment banks collapsed, and workers were laid off. Without the payments being made, there was no money to loan out. Thus, people couldn't get loans to buy things like cars and appliances, so they started pinching pennies elsewhere. Less money was being spent, so the economy started to decline. So, it is my opinion, having experienced the Great Recession, still experiencing it really, that I can hardly see how you can place it on the same caliber as the Great Depression. I mean, technically the same amount of people were unemployed, but when you look at the homelessness rates, homelessness peaked during the Great Depression at 25% as well as the unemployment rate. But in that case, it's encompassing everyone, not just the working population. So that was about 30.5 million people who didn't have a home. Today, or the 2011 statistics show that homelessness in America is currently residing at 0.2%, which is about 636,000 people. So just a little bit of a difference in those numbers. And over the past few years, we've definitely had our fair share of blights and droughts and whatnot. I mean, I come from a farming community. I have experienced that firsthand. But nothing as the same magnitude as the Dust Bowl, nor even close. And so the Dust Bowl really caused people to be quite destitute, as we talked about earlier. Whereas these days, that I feel as though you don't see that as much. I mean, maybe I'm living in the totally wrong area, but I mean, there isn't a great migration somewhere to get help with your life. So I feel as though, like, since the crash, the homelessness rate hasn't really fluctuated much, and I mean, people aren't using feed sacks to make their clothes, as far as I know. And I also get the impression that there are a large amount of people who haven't really felt the Great Recession, and maybe those are just those millionaires out there. But I feel as though other people are just in lucky circumstances where they were in good jobs, that they didn't end up being laid off, and that they hadn't made bad investments. And then I think back to the Great Depression, you think of the Daddy Warbucks character from Little Orphan Annie. So there were those people in the Great Depression, but that's not the people you hear about. And one of the biggest similarities I think exists is that these economic recessions have played a big part in our elections. In the elections of 1932, 1936, 1940, 2008, and the current one happening. It's how the nominees are going to deal with a recession that really leads people to make a big decision about them. I mean, back in the 1930s, Herbert Hoover's lack of involvement with the Great Depression is really what ousted him, and you never know, we might see the same thing happen with President Obama in the next month. However, it was Franklin Roosevelt's heavy involvement that kept him as president for 3 1/4 terms. And I think I get the feeling that when both recessions hit, there was sort of this loss of patriotism. There was no longer this great faith that Americans had formerly had in their government. And there's the claim out there that America is the greatest country in the world, and I would have to say that in the 1920s, America was definitely headed down that road. Like, they were a world leader. The other world leaders were in tatters after World War I. There was really no hope there, but then it all came crashing down. And so it's sort of this loss of faith that really led musicians like Woody Guthrie to be able to rise and be able to write songs and become well known. And Woody took that feeling of helplessness and loss of patriotism and just turned it into songs that really empowered people. And so my biggest question from this whole project was, is there a new Woody Guthrie? And does Woody still have an impact on us today? And as far as I know, I'd have to say that there is not a new Woody Guthrie. Not in the same way as Woody was, or even as Bob Dylan was. In the year 2012, popular music is about making money. That's really the goal of it. And, I mean, Americana music is on the rise, but I mean, can't exactly say I've heard it on the top 40 on Kiss 108, unfortunately. And country music has also become more popular, but country music has sort of turned towards that idea of making money. But you do still find that rare song that has a good message about today. And one of those songs is, I believe, Dierks Bentley's Home. And when I first heard it, I was like, yeah, whatever. And then I saw the music video, and I was like, okay, this really explains what's happening. And it's the same idea of This Land Is Your Land, that it talks about the troubles that are facing America and how Americans are losing faith in the country that their ancestors worked so hard to build. And so it sort of evokes the same feelings that this is our country and we need to take it back. So I'm going to sing Home now. It's our time to do.